Good afternoon to you. I am Mark Sudduth in Wilmington, North Carolina. It is Monday now, the 24th of April, 2023. And today's main topic, this very warm Atlantic versus the oncoming El Nino. I think there's a possibility here that we could see some interesting things as we come up to the hurricane season. Yes, the El Nino is incoming, and yes, it's probably going to be pretty substantial. But look at that Atlantic there. That is very warm. We're going to look at it in closer detail in a moment. Plus, you got all that blue over there off the coast of California, the eastern Pacific there, north of the tropical regions. The cold PDO still very much in place, so a lot of conflicting signals here. And we are closing in now on the start of the hurricane season, just about 5 to 6 weeks away, maybe less than that, depending on how nature wants to do things. Nature doesn't always go by our calendars, right? So we'll talk about that and other topics here, including lower 48 weather, a little bit of a severe weather threat in Texas the next few days, and a couple of other odds and ends, okay? Okay, let's get on with it. Glad you could join me. Let's start off with our good friend, the Southern Oscillation Index. The numbers now getting more negative. There's the last 30 days at negative 2.94. The 90-day is 2.57. And today's contributor, a pretty big hit to the SOI at minus 24. And remember, when these numbers are substantially negative, and we can see the trend here, it's down lately, then you get this atmospheric ocean coupling, so to speak, and we are in a more El Nino-like state. All right, so the SOI going down. I mean, look back at January. We were at 11, and now the 30-day average is basically minus 3. We just can round it up there to or down, whichever way you look at it. So we're definitely losing ground on the SOI. Further indications that we are headed towards an El Nino. All right, I think there's no question about that. So now let's take a look at the actual anomalies out there. Now this is really telling. There's that very warm Atlantic compared to average, a degree or more Celsius above average across this area right here. And if it wasn't for the oncoming El Nino, this would be a very, very ominous sign for a classic positive AMO. That horseshoe shape through there correlates very well with active hurricane seasons if you don't have an El Nino out here. But we do. We have one coming on. It's not there yet, but we're getting there. And then we have this very large area of cold anomalies in the Gulf of Alaska, the eastern Pacific here, north of the tropics. But those cold anomalies do extend down into hurricane country down here, right? I mean, especially over here. And yeah, this will warm up eventually, but that's a huge area of cold PDO signature look to the eastern Pacific, something that I don't think we have seen with a major El Nino. Back in 2015, all of those blues were oranges and reds. We had the loss of marine mammals off the coast of California, San Diego, and vicinity. Again, I talked about this in a recent update that a friend of mine that works over at the Georgia Aquarium was telling me all about that. A marine mammal mortality event or something like that, where they died because of the change in the nutrient patterns because of the very warm waters off the coast of California. A lot of the different food chain ecosystems were changing because of that super El Nino back in 2015. We're not seeing that just yet, and obviously that's a good thing. But I'm telling you, I want to highlight this again. This right here is a very interesting look, and it extends over into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, plus the colder anomalies to neutral in the high latitudes, opposite of what we had last year, especially peak season. It seemed like it really threw things off, that all of this area up here was way above normal, and we also had a warm tropical Atlantic. It was like everything was just skewed. This year it's more of a typical look of an active Atlantic if it weren't for the oncoming El Nino. Now this is an interesting graphic here. The subsurface anomalies really helps to tell the tale as to what's going on. Let's get some colors here that'll help to delineate everything. We use blue. So here's the surface right here. We all understand that. And this is over in the eastern Pacific up here. So we'll put a big E right here. And over here, let's get rid of Mark. Let me just draw on this for you. It'll be better that way. West Pacific's over here. Again, this is the surface. And then this goes down to 450 meters deep. This is a slice through the tropical Pacific, right along the equatorial region, right? That's what it says, equatorial temperature anomaly. The surface up here, let's start over. Yeah, there's the warming with one tiny little island of cool left amongst that ocean of warmth. I said that, I think, in the last episode. That's shrinking. And then way down at about 100 meters or so, between that and about 50 meters, is the true warm pool. And we can just look at the legend here. Everything from this on is 1 degree Celsius or more. So it looks like that's 1 degree right there, that's 2 degrees, that's 3 degrees. And then you really get ridiculously warm anomalies, 4 and 5 Celsius, confined to a very small area. Where? Right off the coast of South America. So that is this right here showing up at the surface. See how that works? It's pretty neat to put it all together. So there are your really ridiculous positive anomalies confined to a pretty small geographic area. Everything else is borderline warm neutral. And the trick is to get all of this to come to the surface. And it's trying. Over here in the eastern Pacific, we're getting some upwelling. And yes, upwelling usually brings cooler water, but as you can see, there is no cooler water down here to upwell. So what drives this, as I've mentioned before, are westerly wind bursts on the left side, which is west, to drive that warm pool slowly eastward, where it upwells, and all there is warm water to upwell. Because again, normally upwelling creates cooler ocean conditions, but in this case, as you can see, the water temperatures in the subsurface are warmer than average. So when you upwell that water, you're upwelling warmer than average water, and then it spreads across the Pacific with whatever trade winds and mechanisms are there. It's not just constant westerly winds, or the Pacific would be well above normal, and life on Earth as we know it probably wouldn't exist. That may be a little bit of an embellishment, but you get the idea. It's not constant westerly winds out there. But what's interesting about this, let me take Mark off the screen for a second so we can pay attention to the graphic. This is rather thin overall. It's also rather deep, more than 100 meters, most of this warmth. And there's only one little area of really substantial, that's 4 degrees Celsius. And it's going to take a lot to get this to come to the surface. So I'm not sold on us having a really strong El Nino yet, and a weak El Nino to moderate El Nino, depending on where these strong anomalies show up eventually. By July, August, September, coupled with that very warm Atlantic, will drive what happens the rest of the hurricane season, or once it even gets started. And to that end, let's take a look at a couple of things here that kind of match up with all of this. I think it's interesting to note a couple of things about the CFS forecast. It gets updated every day, so there's today's update. You got this one end of the world sort of, and again, that's hyperbole. That's a ridiculous off the chart, 3+ Celsius, one of the members of the ensemble there. But notice these blues. These are all the most recent runs, and I'm going to highlight them as best I can. A lot of them are coming in under the ensemble mean, which is this guy right here, this black line. All right? So a lot of the most recent ones, and again, this updates every day, so there's a lot of noise here. But it is interesting that a lot of these members here in blue are coming in under the ensemble mean. There's a couple of them that are still above, plus that ridiculous one right there. So maybe we're going to start settling in as we get out of the spring predictability barrier. That is the time period where the models that are man-made, of course, struggle with natural occurrences and changes in nature, switching from spring to summer in the northern hemisphere, and vice versa, of course, for the southern hemisphere. The computer models try to reckon with all of that, and you get some weird things that happen once in a while. So once we really get to June, I think this will settle, and we'll get to understand more about where the El Nino will be, and that's going to play a critical role in what happens, because again, those warm anomalies in the Atlantic aren't just, they're a little bit warmer over a little bit of an area. It is a vast area of much warmer than average sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic. And I'll say it again and again, if it wasn't for the El Nino, we'd be looking at the possibility, I think last year taught us to never think that anything's going to be taken to the bank, the possibility of a very active hurricane season if it weren't for the El Nino. Now this is interesting. Danny is a CPA in Florida who loves to track the tropics. and he posted this GIF animation from Tropical Tidbits of the CFS, the total accumulated precipitation anomaly going all the way out to September. And this is just an ensemble. I think there's like 12 runs and lots of different forecast averages and whatnot. And you get these updated pretty much every day, right? So this is what it looks like real quick if you just break it down. The GIF animation there is too fast for me to deal with. So let's just look at it straight off of Tropical Tidbits. And this is your June precip anomalies. Let's get what are we using? We just use the blue here. So it's interesting. June shows a pretty wet main development region coming off Africa. There's your intertropical convergence zone. Fairly wet in the southwest Atlantic. Maybe some early season mischief off the east coast. Implied by this, it's just, it's guidance. It's going to change. It's not gospel, so to speak, but it is an interesting look. That is June. What about July? July also shows a very wet Sahel region of Africa, a wet main development region, and a pretty wet southeast Gulf of Mexico. Accumulated precipitation anomaly. These are anomalies in inches. So a pretty wet look overall, plus pretty active looking southeastern Pacific once we get to July. What about August? Now August is also very interesting. We should see all of this shut down if we were going to see a very strong El Nino and a cold Atlantic over here. But we don't have that. We could have a moderate El Nino by August, but the Atlantic running very much warmer than average. There is your wet look to the West African monsoon, sending these systems in the Atlantic. Again, only implied by just looking at the map in front of us. This isn't necessarily what is going to happen. Some anomalies headed towards Florida, some up here in the subtropics. So bringing me back on for just a moment, and just to remember, and look, I get this. This is all the way out to August, for goodness sakes. It could change, but it's interesting to see the trends with everything. And this has been showing up for several weeks now overall, that it's not a dry, barren Atlantic. And as we get closer and closer to resolving what will happen with INSO, El Nino, this will become more believable, so to speak, as a guidepost for what could happen. So let's go on and look at September. This is August. Here is September. Now we start to shut things down in the deep tropics, a much drier look. That makes sense. But look at these precip anomalies in the northeast and eastern Gulf with the Florida Peninsula right in the middle. That is a very interesting look. Why is it showing up like that? I don't know. If I knew, I'd tell you, believe me. And, of course, we have the very wet look to the southeastern Pacific. So that's just something to keep an eye on, a very interesting set of graphics there that Danny was keeping a watch over, as he does very often. And I like what he says here. Very wet look to the deep tropics for the months of June through August before dying off a bit in September per the CFS. An active West African monsoon combined with a very positive AMO, that's what I was showing you, is likely responsible for this look. And we'll just have to see, does the instability pick up down there in the deep tropics, something we haven't seen much going all the way back to 2011. In other words, a more favorable look overall. And then, of course, this is despite the very strong look to the INSO that he points out. There are the responses from different people. But I like this one. This is interesting, too. One of the many benefits of Twitter, if you know where to look, one of our supporters and friends of our project, Matt, down in the Virgin Islands. Yeah, the shear is not particularly overwhelming across the Atlantic. We'll use black here to highlight everything. Pretty strong shear anomalies here, as you'd expect in the Caribbean. Not so much out here in the eastern Atlantic, just east of the islands. This is July through August and into September. And then if you go and just look at August, September, October, the peak of the season, that is not a killer no-season look. You know what I mean? Where there's just no hurricane season, where everything's in red. The blues would be anomalously low shear. These colors are anomalously high shear. And as you can see, where it's expected, right here in the Caribbean because of El Nino, less favorable conditions due to stronger upper-level winds. But everything else is either neutral or slightly favorable overall. So that's an interesting contradiction to what we would normally see from a strong El Nino. All right, this is kind of cool. A lot of you probably saw this over the weekend if you're paying attention. A big mesoscale convective complex, giant cluster of thunderstorms moving across the Gulf of Mexico, and our good friends over there at the Tropical Analysis and Forecast Branch tweeted this, and their government associated, and this is, the whole Twitter thing. Not even going to go there, but yes, they are verified because they are a government agency, whatever. So yes, this is the real TAFB. It's crazy we even have to talk about this stuff. But the point is, this very strong complex, those reds there, you get the wind barbs and all the different products that we can see the atmosphere, very fast-moving convective complex there going across the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of the oil interest out there probably had a rock and roll weekend as that system moved off of Texas and across the Gulf. Now this will start to become important, these complexes, as we get towards June and we get some more spin maybe going on down in the Caribbean once we transition closer to the start of the hurricane season and the Central American gyre, if that does set up. We'll have to watch. You got to have a lot less of those red flags there. Those reds are very strong upper level winds. What do they say? Upper level winds 70 to 80 knots of westerly wind shear going across the Gulf. Got to lose that first. But anyway, I think that's just an interesting animation, and I wanted to point it out to you. All right, let's wrap things up over the next 3 tabs here. Lower 48 weather. Hey, frost and freeze advisories for a good chunk of the Appalachians here and elsewhere straddling that region. Possibly some wintry weather for our friends in the Rockies. More snow? Bring it, because that helps to feed the Colorado River Basin ever so slightly more. That's fantastic. Otherwise, a generally quiet pattern weather-wise in terms of any big blockbuster events. But if you look real close, and I'll help you with that, right in here along the Mississippi, we got some big flooding concerns. I know that Fox Weather was covering that with Robert Ray recently in Davenport, Iowa. Snowmelt, the rivers coming up. Remember recently, last year, the Mississippi was at record low levels. Now we're starting to see flooding. Nature is a very fickle creature, isn't it? So, you got to look on the map and click, and just as an example, there you go. All of the Mississippi there outlined in green. And then there's a freeze watch on top of all that. So go figure. All right, SPC. This is today's outlook. Hey, look, more rain and disruptive weather in southeast Florida. Hooray! Hopefully it doesn't flood Fort Lauderdale Airport again, or maybe worse, Miami. But yes, seriously, keep this in mind if you're traveling down there. Southeast Florida, I-95, the Turnpike, etc. You got 75 further to the south. But, yeah, that's no good when you get that much rain in one metropolitan area like that. So be on the lookout for that. Elsewhere, general thunderstorms across these areas right through here. Nothing to be too concerned with. Now, tomorrow, the shift of severe weather happens to be down in Texas. And the tornado threat, not 0, 2 to 5%, depending on where you are. A little bit of a wind threat as well, with a more significant threat of some pretty large hail. And that extends down to southeast Florida as well. So just keep that in mind for those areas. Finally, out to Wednesday, Texas, the Lone Star State, hogging parts of the Red River over to the Arklatex region. Still is where the slight risk extends. We might see an enhanced get thrown in there in due time. We'll see. And then days 4 through 8, pretty innocuous overall. One thing I'll say about severe weather, it looks like we're going to have a pretty big trough in the east. That's why you got those cold anomalies for temperatures along the Appalachians and the frost and freeze advisories. And with that trough, you get northwest flow coming down the plains, and that's just not conducive for severe weather. But, and here's the good news, let's go over to this tweet from John. We could see very beneficial rains for parts of western Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, southwest Kansas. This is great news because that area has been dry over the last 180 days or so. And so this is really good to see. And that'll start to help to literally plant the seeds for potential severe weather once we get into May. It's hard to explain what all that means or why I say that, but this is a big key to that happening once we get to May. So it looks like we're going to lay down 1 to 2 inches plus. These are anomalies here over the next couple of few days in areas that desperately need it. And then it looks like, looking at the tea leaves, as they say, Once we get into early May and beyond, the pattern will change, and we're going to get more southwesterly flow out in the plains, and severe weather season should ramp up. And we're going to take our project out there and test some equipment. We're going to take a couple of our anemometers and set them up along the dry line, get some of those howling winds, maybe a big old thunderstorm. Just got to watch the hail. Hail and anemometers don't mix very well. Just kind of testing all of our hurricane stuff in Tornado Alley. Why not? We have the ability to do so, the personnel to help, and thanks to our Patreon support and my relationship with Fox Weather, the funding, because it cost a lot of money to do this stuff. And we're looking forward to taking our equipment and doing some testing, maybe even launching the weather balloon with its camera system, the GoPros, in front of a dry line. I've been working with Greg Nordstrom, a good friend of ours from Mississippi State University, about that idea. So a lot of interesting things coming up in the month before hurricane season gets here, all right? And we'll talk about all of that later. Okay, that is it from me for today. Don't forget, on YouTube, pretty much where everybody watches these videos, like, subscribe, share, you know the deal. Let's get those algorithms. Boy, if I could ever figure out the algorithm, we would really have something amazing, right? That's what they all say. But I really do appreciate you tuning in. It's awesome. Don't forget to click that notification button if you are subscribed, because apparently that's how you get notified that I posted something. And you don't want to miss that. All right, have a great rest of your week. I am Mark Sudduth. I'll talk to you again next Monday.